today to talk about the exhibit. He received his MFA at the Yale University School of Art and studied with Walker Evans, who is perhaps known for best photo documenting families and the South during the Great Depression. He's received numerous distinguished grants and awards, including the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, a commission to photograph America's Forgotten Places, a bicentennial commemoration, and twice he's received the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. He's taught at the University of Tennessee since 1982. Before that, he instructed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Massachusetts College of Art, and Yale University. His photographs are in many permanent collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, University of Michigan Museum of Art, University of Kentucky Art Museum, Yale University Art Gallery, the Museum of the City of New York, and of course our favorite here at home, the Knoxville Museum of Art. Baldwin's work was last exhibited here at the museum in 2010. It was an exhibition called Vision, Language, and Influence, Photographs of the South. The exhibition also featured photographs by Walker Evans and Eudora Welty. It is our extreme pleasure in having you here with us today.
I'd like to start, if I can, in the corner with this one simple photograph. It's not a matter of circumstance that Robert Frank is cited by many of the other photographers in this exhibition as having been a primary influence. Robert Frank was a Swiss-born photographer, and his work is a good point for us to start to talk about this exhibition, its history, its context, and the influence that it's had on the art of photography. When you take a look at this Robert Frank photograph, I think you'll notice that along its border you'll see a black edge, and at the very bottom you see little scalloped black shapes. For those people who can remember back to the days when film was used in photography, this is the giveaway for what kind of film Robert Frank used. He used a 35mm camera. Robert Frank made this photograph along with over 20,000 other ones on a series of 3 trips that started from New York City, where he drove across country, one a route that took him through the Rust Belt, through cities like Cleveland and Chicago, ultimately into Northern California. Another one through the Midwestern states, through places that included Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and across the middle of the country. And then finally, another trip that brought him into the South through Savannah, through Georgia, New Orleans, and across to New Mexico. And on these 3 trips, Robert Frank took over 700 rolls of 36 exposure film, which adds up to quite a few thousand photographs. The number of photographs that he took on these trips is comparable to that of what it is that many people do today with a digital camera, but all of this film was processed by hand, and at the end of these travels, he distilled these photographs, these 27,000 photographs, into a group of 83, which were ultimately published in a book that was called The Americans, and this was published in 1959 in Paris. One of the people who was Robert Frank's influence was my teacher, Walker Evans, and when Walker Evans photographed, he used a camera that was mounted on a tripod, a large format camera like this, a kind of camera that requires, if you're photographing somebody, firstly, that person knows he or she's being photographed. There's no such thing as surreptitious photography with a camera that size. And the other thing about this camera is that it required that person to say yes, to give permission, and then to pose, to cooperate. And that theme of the extent to which people knew that they were being photographed, the extent to which they posed, the extent to which they gave their permission, is something that we can talk about with all the photographs in this exhibition because it varies. The Robert Frank photograph in this regard is notable in that Robert Frank used a 35mm Leica camera where the act of taking the picture is like what it is that you do today with your digital point-and-shoot camera. A quick, easy to use, spontaneous device that allowed him to literally walk up to a subject with certain presetting of the camera's parameters, lift his camera up to his eye, frame, take the picture, and just as quickly be done with it, oftentimes without his subjects knowing that they had even been photographed. And with that as an introduction, we can talk about some of the other photographs. So along the photo, if you can come into the gallery space now and take a look at these other, into the photographs along these two walls around this corner. These are photographs by Jerry Berndt, and these photographs take me back to my college days. I was an undergraduate at MIT between 1968 and 1972, and MIT is in Boston. And these photographs made by Jerry Berndt were done in a portion of Boston that was then called the Combat Zone. And the Combat Zone was Boston's version of Times Square before Times Square was cleaned up. It had seedy theaters, bookstores, bars. It was not the savory part of Boston. It was sort of the antithesis of what Harvard and MIT were about. And what Jerry Berndt did was he chose to spend time in this portion of Boston where he looked at the denizens of the night, and he made these photographs. And if you take a look at them, you can tell by how close he was in many of these pictures that, unlike the Robert Frank photograph, these people knew that they were being photographed. They probably, in fact, posed for his photographs. And with that in mind, these photographs of Berndt's are fundamentally really quite different from those of Robert Frank's in that one can imagine that there may exist a series of photographs of these two prostitutes, that this may not have been the only one, that because he was able to approach them, because he was able to ask for their permission, because they said yes, once a photographer has received permission from somebody to be photographed, it's more likely than not for the photographer to ask to make another photograph. For those of you who are interested in the way photographs look, about the technology of the day, black and white film in the 1960s was not particularly sensitive. Most of the photographers in this exhibition, in fact, used a 400 speed, a 400 ISO film. And if you take a good close look at some of these pictures, you'll see that the images are characterized by a granular texture. They're very grainy. And for Jerry Berndt to make his photographs, especially the night photographs, he butted up against this problem of having sufficient light to expose his film. Notice that these are pictures all done with existing light. That is, that he didn't use an external flash. That was a conscious choice on his part. He didn't want to add a flash that would change the look of the scene. He wanted that ambient light, the look of night, the feeling of night to be the dominant sense of emotion in the photograph. And so what he had to do in making these photographs was he had to push the limits of his materials. In fact, he would underexpose his film and then attempt to compensate for that by overdeveloping in a darkroom. And so you're looking at images that are made where the materials are really being pushed to their very limits. With the ability to work with hindsight, there are several photographers in this exhibition whose influence has extended beyond the decade of the 60s. And among them is Lee Freelander, whose work in photography continues to be among the most vital and interesting. His work has extended over a period of more than 50 years, and I think that, that this group of photographs serves as a really good introduction to what it was that he started with in his career. And if you're interested in doing a little bit of research, you can see how a photographer's career can progress from decade to decade, subject to subject, camera to camera, technology to technology. These two photographs of Lee Freelander's are pictures that he calls self-portraits. Here he is depicted in a side view mirror of a truck, and here he is casting his shadow on a pile of sod. Compare what it is that he's doing with these self-portraits to what Jerry Berndt did with the people in the combat zone. If Jerry Berndt was really interested in a particular subculture, wanting to show you something that you may have found difficult to see yourself, or you would have been afraid to go to see for yourself, Lee Freelander's choice of subject is entirely different. His photographs, as compared to Berndt's, aren't so much subject matter driven, but they're driven more by his interest in the medium of photography itself. What constitutes a photograph? How can photographs be made? What are photographs about? How are photographs different from seeing the real thing in the world? And you can't really say that Lee Freelander was as interested in the people in his photographs as Jerry Berndt was interested in his people. So his pictures that include people aren't the kinds of pictures that you would call portraits, but they're photographic studies. And there's an aspect about Lee Freelander that consistently shows up in all of his work for the previous 50 years, and one of them is his appreciation of something that I call photographic intelligence, and the other is his sense of humor. An example of that is in this photograph. Here's a photograph through a store window, and in that store window, part of the window's been painted white, been whited out, but then there's a portion of the window that has been left unpainted, and in it we see a man who's slumped over at a table. For those of you who have familiarity with a large format camera like the one that I showed you at the beginning of my talk, you'll look at this little cutout part and you'll see a little ear on it in the upper left-hand corner. And where's Martin? It looks like a contact print from a 4x5 or 8x10 negative. And what it is that Lee Freelander is doing here is that he's taking a picture of a picture, making you think about what photography is. It's about framing, it's about the moment, it's about taking something, taking it out of context. And in making this photograph, in putting that white around it, it's just exactly the same as the museum putting the white mat around another window. So it's about photography more so than it is about its particular subject. At the end of the wall, Freelander talks more and more about the act of taking pictures and how taking pictures is different from looking at something. When we look at the world with our own two eyes, we see everything in context. Our peripheral vision allows us to see a very wide spread. But in a photograph, because we see through the viewfinder of the camera, and the viewfinder is a rectangle, it cuts. So this, which would constitute for many people the cutting of the faces, the non-inclusion of the tops of heads and eyes, would constitute an error in framing, a mistake. Freelander's doing that on purpose because he's talking about what it is a photograph does. And what a photograph does is it takes things out of context. They're excerpts, and the excerpt has these specific four edges. So that photograph is maybe more about the four edges than it is about what's happening in the middle. If you look at this photograph, it's a totally nonsensical photograph. There's a profile of a black woman, a sign, and this father and a child. I mean, what is this a photograph about? What is its subject? What is the photographer trying to do? Squint at this photograph for a second, narrow your eyes and look at it, and you'll begin to understand what the photographer was doing. Notice how the profile of this woman blends in with the blackness of the sign, and it looks as if that unit is cut out from another photograph and pasted on top of this one. Look at how the father and the son stand out. They look as if they're cut out from another snapshot put together. This piece looks almost more like a collage than it does look like a photograph. And what Friedlander is talking about here is how something in the world which is near, something which is in the middle ground, and something that is far, how a photograph takes 3 dimensions and collapses them to 2 dimensions. He's talking about the frame and the flatness, and that's what photographs are about. One of Friedlander's contemporaries was Gary Winogrand, and Winogrand is, he's one of the big stars in this exhibition. Winogrand took this art of street photography and probably carried it as far as anybody else has. He too worked with a Leica camera, and he was a bear of a man. Large, heavy, absolutely your quintessential consummate New Yorker. He would be unafraid of anybody or anything, and he would stick his camera anywhere and aim it and push the button anytime. His process of photographing was really interesting. Here's a scene of American Legionnaires on a street corner on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, and in the middle of the photograph is this man who's missing his legs. First, we've been told ever since we were little that it's a horribly impolite thing to stare at somebody less fortunate than ourselves. And what's worse than staring? Taking a picture. It's a permanent stare. And so Winogrand really wanted to take a picture of that man. And he was interested not just in getting a close-up, but rather seeing that man in the context of the other people. He wanted you to see all the other legs, to make the point that this man had no legs, to compare and to contrast. And do you see how this Legionnaire is looking up like that? What Winogrand would do is he would walk into a crowd, and people would move, and he would look up, they would look up, and he would do this. He described his physical way of making pictures. He compared it to a basketball player that he said he had the moves. Take a close look at this photograph, and on the ground here, you'll see embedded in the sidewalk stars. This is in Los Angeles. It's the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And notice the way the sunlight is coming toward the camera. Notice how the sunlight is bouncing off the windows, and we have like light coming from multiple directions. It's as if these young ladies are stars on stage with the light coming toward. And if they're the stars, if they're the ones being illuminated, look at what's happening in the wings. There's a man in a wheelchair, slumped over. For Winogrand, the world was a place that was a drama, a theatrical production that was unfolding every moment, and he saw his mission as being one where he would capture that drama as it was unfolding. Winogrand's photographs are sometimes problematic too. I think the first reaction that people have to this photograph made in the Central Park Zoo of this couple with the chimpanzees is that they laugh. I mean, it is an absolutely ridiculous thing that a couple would bring their pets to the zoo. I mean, what are they going to do? Show their chimpanzees other chimpanzees, and and admonish them that if they're not good, they're going to wind up behind bars, just like, So it is but it is an absurd thing. But if one looks at and thinks about this photograph historically and sociologically, one can't help but bring to this photograph other kinds of knowledge that may not reside within the photograph itself, but come from your own knowledge and experience of the world. You can't help but look at the fact that this couple is of mixed race. He's black and she's white. And so much of this exhibition that continues on the other side is about the civil rights movement. Some of the origins of the civil rights movement had to do with aspects of racial discrimination, prejudice, misunderstanding, and outright hatefulness. And it has been said that if interracial marriage occurs, the children are going to suffer, they're going to turn out to be less than human. This could be seen as a photograph having, instead of just simply a humorous sort of an attitude about it, you could have a really very, very sobering sort of undertone about prejudice and misbeliefs. I'd like to talk about this photograph of the man who seems to be begging. And coming from one side of the frame is this arm and this hand that seems to be clenched in the gesture of a fist. I think he's begging. His hand is upturned. And I don't know how to interpret this gesture of that fist. Does that fist contain change? Is he about to give this man some spare change? Or is it a fist saying, get out of my way? Leave me alone. Is it a belligerent act? One can interpret that as one wishes. I mean, that's all happening within the frame of this photograph and that particular instant. But I like to talk about this from the standpoint of the photographer. Wasn't this a particularly belligerent thing for him to have taken this photograph? One can argue that if one is begging on the street, it's not the moment that you would choose to have memorialized. And could you not argue that not only is Gary Winogrand not helping the situation, he's exploiting it? And this business of photographers having, on one hand, their ambitions to make good photographs, and then on the other hand, the rights and the privacy of those who are being photographed, there's this balance here. I mean, this isn't a matter of law. There isn't any law against having done what Gary Winogrand did, but it's more a question of morals and ethics. Can we argue that with Jerry Berndt that in his photographs of the combat zone that the ends justify the means? Or is he too exploiting his subject? This is something that all photographers have to think about, especially those photographers whose work originates from outside sources. I'm not certain if the museum consciously separated out the work that's in this gallery from the one where we just were. But there is a distinction in the work between the two places. In the previous room, The Robert Frank, the Jerry Berndt, the Lee Freelander, and the Gary Winogrand, they were photographs made from the standpoint of the photographer being the outsider, somebody who did not belong to the group or the individuals, but rather was an outsider looking in to somebody else's culture. Whereas here in this room, to varying extents, the photographers who made these photographs could not have made these photographs if they had not been embraced by their subjects too. On this wall are photographs by the American photographer Deanne Arbus, and it could be said that of all the photographers in this exhibition, her work probably, from the standpoint of 2012, has been the most influential. She was a terrifically interesting, compelling figure in history photography. She was born into affluence. Her father owned a furrier shop on Fifth Avenue, New York. They grew up on the Upper West Side. They had a nanny. Her brother, Howard Nemeroff, was the first poet laureate of the United States. So she came from a very, very, very solid background. But she was the black sheep of the family. When she grew up, she wasn't interested in any of the social world that she was supposed to have entered into. Instead, she was fascinated with the under culture of New York, female impersonators, transvestites, citizens of the street. She would prowl the streets of New York looking for people who would be considered members of the fringe of society. She was fascinated by them, introduced herself to them, really became their friends, and out of that relationship, she was able then to make photographs. So these aren't pictures taken like the Robert Frank photograph with a camera just click and run. Instead, in the square photographs, Arbus used a camera like this one, a twin lens reflex camera, a camera which took a larger negative, which enables you to make a larger, clearer print, and a camera that is slower in operation, that definitely requires the act of posing. And so when you take a look at Arbus's photographs, these are each the product of both the photographer and also the subject. They agreed. They participated. The work is in the end collaborative. Arbus's photographs are oftentimes simplified and misunderstood as being just photographs of people who are on the fringe of society. The truth of the matter is that Arbus was genuinely interested in her subjects, and her photographs, as descriptive as they are, wind up in the end asking more questions than they answer. In this photograph, the Puerto Rican woman with the beauty mark, we all know what it's like to look into a mirror. And we see ourselves, of course, but what we see isn't based purely on physiognomy. It's based on who we would like to see, who we don't like to see, what parts of us are. It's not just simply an acknowledgement of the features of your face. So what do? We spend time to make ourselves look better. And we put on makeup, and we put on mascara, and we put on eyeliner, and we put on lipstick. And when we do this, we're not doing it to make ourselves grotesque, although it may result in that, at least to some viewers. But we're really trying to make ourselves better. I mean, it's not our intention to overshoot in our lip liner, you know, but it happened. And when Arbus made this photograph, what it was that really interested her was why it is each of us is never satisfied with the way that we look, and why we all think that we can make ourselves look better. And so instead of looking at her and pointing at her and laughing at her, look in the mirror and ask yourself why you look the way that you look. And aren't you just part of the world that she is from as well? Arbus's photographs are provocative this way. They make us answer many questions that we just have assumed that we know the answers to. The next photographer in this exhibition, Danny Lyon, he made it his business to be as much of an insider as possible in the making of his photographs. And he set out challenges for himself to be a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang from Chicago. I mean, he didn't just show up one weekend and take a couple of rolls of film. He joined them. He was a member of this outlaw motorcycle gang. He was a member for 2 years. And so when he made photographs, these are photographs made from somebody who's not just simply looking in, but somebody who's living it from his own experience. How else would he have been able to get portraits as intimate as this? How else could he have come up on scenes like this? These are photographs from penal situations in Texas, where he spent a great deal of time too. And when you look at Danny Lyon's work, you can't help but think about the motivations that photographers have. All of us like to look, and looking is free. I mean, if you've got a pair of eyes, you can look. But there are some things that if you choose to look at them, there's a price of admission. And to be willing to do what Danny Lyon did is an indication of the size of his ambition. He really wanted to make these photographs. And so he put himself into situations which were uncomfortable, dangerous, trying. He knew that if he were not willing to do that, to pay that particular price, there would be no picture. It's too simple a thing to look at a photograph and say that it was easy to make because all it required was the pushing of a button. Sure, the pushing of a button doesn't require any effort whatsoever, but being there, being accepted, being taken in, to allow for that button to be pushed is really something that a photographer has to earn.
What kind of camera do you think he used?
Almost all of the rectangular photographs in this exhibition were made with a Leica camera, a 35mm rangefinder camera. This was really the standard that still exists today for people who are shooting film. And another thing about the cameras that and the equipment used in this exhibition, unlike many of us, when we go out to purchase a camera today, we're interested in how much the camera lens can zoom, you know, thinking that, oh, I can stand far away and take a picture without somebody knowing. The vast majority of the photographs taken in this exhibition are taken within arm's length or a little bit farther, not much farther. So the photographers are right there. They're very much present in the context of the picture taking. When photographers get pictures like this, it's like Christmas morning. You know, as much as you may wish for something, sometimes you get something better. And those are the ones that we really, we know we work hard, but sometimes we get rewarded beyond the effort expended, and that's an example of that. At this point in the exhibition, we have a concentration in our focus, and that is toward the political life in the 60s in America. And this was the tumultuous decade where we saw a president assassinated, his brother assassinated, the leader of the civil rights movement assassinated, the rise of groups such as the Black Panthers. In the 60s, voter registration rights, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, riots in American cities. It was a tumultuous decade, and some of us are old enough to remember what it was like. All this was occurring simultaneously with the Vietnam War too. And one simply, in looking at some of these photographs, could not imagine this world having happened at all or happening again, but it did. This next set of photographs are made by Ruth Marion Baruch, and in continuing the theme of the insider, Baruch's politics were clearly very sympathetic with those in the civil rights movement. She was a self-avowed leftist and very much saw it as a mission for her to portray the Black Panthers in a way that they weren't being portrayed in the popular press. If you take a look at her photographs, her portraits, if we were to divorce ourselves from the politics and the social issues that the photographs come from, if we were to talk about these photographs just simply as portraits, these are portraits which demonstrate a particular attitude that the photographer had relative to her subjects. And she has the utmost of respect, affection, and almost reverence for her subjects. She is interested in capturing moments when there is a sense of strength and nobility in the people that she's taking pictures of. Unlike photographs that appeared in the popular press, which showed these people in far less flattering ways, it was Baruch's intent to show them as human beings. Her interest was in showing things like a father feeding his baby, not just in raised fists and in rifles and ammunition. I feel kind of old because Ruth Marion Baruch studied with, among the different people that she studied when she was in California, she studied with Minor White, who was also my teacher when I was going to college. So I have this connection with some of these photographers. On these two walls are the works of Ernest Withers. the very talented, highly recognized African-American journalist and photojournalist. And his photographs, I think, provide the best background narrative to the civil rights movement in the 60s in this country. He, of course, was an insider, and it enabled him to get photographs which are just astoundingly intimate. I think this is one of the really beautiful and powerful pieces in the exhibition. If people like Deanne Arbus at the other end of this gallery, if she was interested in personal, psychological, individual sorts of issues, it's clear when you take a look at Withers' photographs that his intent had to do with preserving something for all of history. Oftentimes, when a photographer is standing in front of his or her subject, you begin to realize that your subject is much more important than you or your intent is. Whatever it is you think you want to do, whatever it is you think your photograph is going to be about, there are those rare instances when you know that it's just simply a privilege to be present, and your job then is really much simplified because you want to, as best you can, document and preserve what's going on. And I think that Withers' real gift was he had that ability to show you in a single photograph an image that anyone would be able to understand and derive meaning from, where you would need no caption, where it was entirely self-contained. Withers was a documentarian of an important era in American history, and he was also somebody who bore witness through his camera. Yeah, these are I think, really very beautiful pieces. And the last photographer in this exhibition, Bruce Davidson. This set of photographs is a combination of a couple of projects. One where he photographed the civil rights movement, and another project that's labeled East 100th Street. It was a documentary project that he adopted on his own. And there are two really different kinds of photographs. The East 100th Street photographs weren't made because of the historical significance of the particular political event. These East 100th Street photographs were made because he was interested in them personally. And this was a neighborhood in Spanish Harlem in New York. And when Bruce Davidson went to photograph, instead of using a smaller camera, he brought out that view camera that I showed you right next to the Robert Frank pictures. A camera that is slow in operation, that requires posing, and he did so because he wanted to make certain that the people who resided in his neighborhood trusted him. He wanted to make certain that they knew what he was doing, how he was doing it, that he wasn't in any way engaging in any kind of subterfuge, He wanted to be as upfront about it as possible. So if you take a real good close look at the East 100th Street photographs, get right up on top of them, you'll see the detail and the clarity. It's a different kind of a photograph from photographs like the 35mm photographs, which have the granular texture to them. Davidson is a member of the most important group of photojournalists. It's called Magnum. And this is an organization that merits your further investigation. It was started by the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, and for everybody who has any intentions today of being a successful photojournalist, your ultimate goal would be to be accepted into this group of Magnum photographers. So it's one of the highest accolades that any photographer could have, and has been bestowed upon Bruce Davidson. So in this exhibition, we've had the opportunity to look at the relationship that photographers can have with their subjects, to what extent you can befriend and be sympathetic to your subject. Compare the Baruch photographs with how a photographer can be just really as callous and boorish as a Gary Winograd. How photographers can have as a center of their focus something that resides deeply within themselves, a Deanne Arbus, to a photographer whose interests, like in the Withers photographs, are in the larger sense of history. When there's a little bit of in this exhibition, a little bit of a hint about how photographs come about, the will and the ambition of photographers, and a little bit about the choice of equipment and process by which they made these photographs.